You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
We're often working to modify our own behaviors, whether it's changing a bad habit or starting a new routine that will improve our lives for the better. But what makes it so difficult when we already have a pretty good idea of what we should be doing? And how can we make sure the behavior changes we're working toward can make the most lasting impacts? I'm Dr. Emily O'Brien, a population health research faculty member at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. And today I'm pleased to speak with Dr. Chuck Scales, also a DCRI faculty member, to learn more about behavior modification. He'll also shed light on why it's so difficult to make these changes, psychologically and practically, and which behavior changes can make the most lasting impacts. Welcome, Chuck, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily. It's really great to join you on the podcast today.
To start out, let's talk about one of the biggest motivators for behavior change, or at least the structure that really, in some ways, a lot of us hope will fuel behavior change, which is New Year's resolutions. I think most of us are now at the point where it's clear if we have kept or not kept our resolutions. So let's just, before I confess all of my failures with respect to resolutions, of which there are many, let's ask you as our guest, did you have a New Year's resolution? And if so, how did it go?
Well, so I think I had two main resolutions, one of which was to continue my streak of drinking water on a daily basis and hitting a goal. It's the same thing that I prescribe for my kidney stone patients so that I can be a good example for them. And I'm going to have to confess that things fell apart there. Approximately 4-year streak was ended at that point for some technical reasons, and maybe we can go into that later on. The other thing is, everyone I think is a common one. It's just to be more physically active, get in shape, et cetera, eat better, that kind of thing. And I will say a variable success in achieving that depending on the week and what else is going on in my life.
Yeah, certainly was for me too. So my perpetual New Year's resolution is to meditate for 10 minutes every day. I would give myself like a D- in 2025. Definitely did not have even close to as impressive a streak as you did. But I guess in some ways, I kept my streak of breaking my New Year's resolution alive now for about 10 years. And I think I need a different tactic. I always think if I just read a little bit more about the science behind meditation, how it's good for every aspect of psychological health and functioning and well-being, maybe I'll just find one study that really sends the message home. But my feeling is now I should probably take a step back and think about actually changing my thinking or maybe even the environment to try to make it more achievable. But we're here to talk about some really interesting trial results and kind of the broader topic of behavior change. So we'll, I'm sure, get into some of these dynamics a bit more. So you know a lot about this. You are also a urologist, and this is not typically the specialty that comes to mind as we think about somebody who's an expert in behavior change. Tell us what pulled you into this topic and why were you interested in studying human habits in the first place?
That's a great question. And I will have to say that it probably started back when I was a fellow at UCLA on the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program. And it was a time when behavioral economics was really coming to the fore. There was a lot of interest from leaders at University of Pennsylvania and other places where these were being applied to people's behaviors related to health. And I did a couple of studies then that focused on how we could get people to engage in educational programs about quality and safety of healthcare. And we did some pretty simple things, just taking a look at the power of social incentives versus more tangible financial incentives and how those might affect people's behavior. That was where I first became interested. And then, a few years ago now, the opportunity to participate in Design Push tied me back to urology and kidney stone disease, which is one of my big passions.
I'll say as somebody who, as with any human, is sort of interested in why we behave the way that we do and like our motivations, this is a field that maybe more than any other field, at least it feels like to me, has some shocker research finding like all the time. Like, oh, here's something that we think is going to motivate people. And like, it didn't work at all. We're like, we had these 4 incentives and like the one that we thought would be worse was actually best or whatever. Has it felt that way to you as a scientist? And does that mean that we're setting these studies up in a way that maybe doesn't really recognize what the key drivers are of behavior?
I think in some ways you're right. Behavior change, and especially sustaining behavior change, is really difficult. And this is why people fall down on the New Year's resolutions. Maybe you get 4 to 6 weeks in, and then something knocks you off your course. And so I think that's one of the big challenges, is that there are a lot of distractions in life, competing time demands, that really get in the way of what we're doing. Kidney stones are usually thought about as a surgical disease, but the reality is they are actually preventable. Not many people know that. And a lot of your lifestyle and diet and behavior related to those things, like drinking water, is a big component of the prevention plan. So that's partly why, for me as a clinician, this idea of how do we change behaviors and how do we promote more healthy behaviors is really important.
Well, and I imagine that you've looked at this from a research perspective, but also as a provider, there are some real constraints on what a single clinical visit can really even accomplish. Like even for someone like yourself, if a patient comes in and they have a physician who is aware of a lot of these drivers and what's at play and how hard it is to change behavior, like there's only so much you can do within that setting, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts, like just thinking about the healthcare system kind of more broadly. Is some of it also a challenge with respect to resourcing and maybe not having enough time or the right team members there to really guide people in a way that makes sense to them?
That's a great point. I think there are a lot of structural barriers in the healthcare system. In an ideal world, we would have someone who would be a nutritionist or a dietitian that could work with my kidney stone patients, but there's not great models for that, for paying for that preventive service in the healthcare system, right? We're really much more incentivized financially towards me taking people to the OR and getting their kidney stones out. And so that's one of the challenges there in terms of the structural barriers to helping patients make their change in behavior.
Yeah, not to get too meta about it, but it's almost like the health system is an individual itself that has its own incentives that are driving its behavior that then flow down to what patients are actually, feasibly able to accomplish in terms of their recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. The incentives are a big issue and a big driver for behavior, and certainly the health system has its own set of incentives to deal with.
You studied this, we were talking at a high level, but you studied this in a really robust way through the PUSH study, and you had a very specific question. Can you give us a little bit of background about sort of what was known about the topic and why this trial is so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PUSH trial was really important because it's the largest prevention trial for stones to date. And it essentially was set up to test, in part, the main guideline for kidney stone prevention is to drink water. And that's actually based on a very small trial that was done in the 1980s, a small study from Italy that was designed to have one group drink high intake of water and therefore make a lot of urine that was dilute. And the other group was assigned basically to continue their very low fluid intake. In fact, that fluid intake in the control arm there was much lower than I think most people drink on the baseline here now. And so I think there's some controversy about, what is the right control group and, what do we compare this to if we're trying to figure out how to keep people adherent to the fluid intake goal, which is the current guideline standard. In that context, the PUSH study was set up to have an arm that would have some behavioral interventions for people to be ideally better at adhering to that fluid goal. And then the control arm was just individuals who were getting the usual care they were getting from their kidney stone provider, and they were given a bottle to help them track the fluid as well, but no other incentives beyond those.
As you're developing these interventions, do you get a lot of feedback from patient stakeholders or from communities about, what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, and how did your plan change with that feedback?
Oh, great question. So we had our initial design based mostly on some basic principles and some expertise we had from behavioral scientists here at Duke and University of Pennsylvania and some of the other individuals who were part of the consortium. We did go through some feedback from patients and physicians about the protocol and what we were asking people to do. And they seemed to think this was reasonable since it was very much based on the guidelines and very common behavioral intervention strategies that have a lot of evidence behind them. Well, I don't think we got too far away from what would be standard for research practice in this area.
Yeah, it's such an important part of the way that we think about our research these days. And it's been interesting to watch that change happen over the past 10 or 15 years. And I'm always just so excited when I can sit down with somebody who is 100% candid and tells me like the idea is terrible or like we need to go a
Right.
very different direction. To me, it's so much more efficient to find that out early rather than when you get into the study and can't recruit anybody because nobody wants to do what you're proposing that they do. So yeah, that kind of feedback can really be invaluable. So how did the study go? I know it was a long process. I assume, as with every other prospective project, everything went perfectly. There were no deviations from the plan. You got 8 hours of sleep every night from the time you finalized the protocol. That's what happened, right?
Yep, exactly. Right until we enrolled the first participant. That's when you find out how it's really going to work. So it was definitely a longer trial than we expected. And then the other thing that happened in the middle of that was, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. And then that actually, believe it or not, was the crisis that forced us to adapt in ways that probably enable a faster completion of the trial, because this was a trial that was not addressing a life-threatening condition, as it were. You may recall a lot of places, the only clinical trials that could proceed were things that were, cancer medications or you dealing with a life-threatening condition. And so our study was put on pause. And so we had some time to reflect about what can we do differently? How can we really, in the context of the restrictions here, enroll patients in a different way that allows us to continue the trial, but yet minimize their risks? And we realized that, in essence, everything that we needed to do, except for one, CT scan at the beginning of the study, could be done remotely. So having the secondary radiographic endpoint that was not super important and was not the primary endpoint of our trial, maybe we could relax the requirement there, which our DSMB allowed us to do. And so then we were able to enroll people at our sites without engaging them in an in-person visit. And at that point, we realized, well, wait a second, if we can do this at our sites, why can't we take this nationwide? And so we actually did that. And we've written about that in the Journal of Urology about what the implications are. But we actually then began to essentially open up our study to individuals across the entire nation who could then, enroll remotely. We could mail them the water bottle, all the information they needed, go through the setup and the enrollment and the consent and the remote visit. And it really actually accelerated our enrollment for the trial and was a really important innovation, I think, that came out of the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic.
We've seen that a lot with the Pragmatic Trials Collaboratory that we have a few folks who help lead here at Duke. And it was so interesting because we surveyed our team members for the demonstration projects and said, how did this affect you? Was it like a total catastrophe, or like, were there any good parts? And a lot of them pointed out that some of the same things that you're saying, which is there are ways that we were doing things before that we had to change by necessity because of the pandemic. And actually, some of those changes were good ones. And we're going to keep some of those around for future trials to try to achieve some of the same benefits in terms of diversity and accessibility. So I don't think any of us would want to go through that difficult period again, but it's really gratifying to see that we at least learned a lot. We're forced to learn a lot, maybe, and that we can take more flexible approaches in some cases. Let's talk about the results. What did you find?
So what we found was that in terms of primary endpoint, and this is a little surprising and disappointing, that despite all of our best efforts to get folks to drink more fluid and therefore prevent stones, what we showed was that in the control group and the intervention arm, the results were almost the same. About 18 to 19% of individuals had a symptomatic stone recurrence over the 2-year follow-up period, and that was not statistically significant. So it was a neutral trial. I will say, interestingly, though, what did change was that in the intervention arm, those individuals did drink more fluid, as evidenced by how we measure this clinically, which is we measure your urine output in a 24-hour period, and that correlates very strongly with fluid intake. And so we actually did show that in the intervention arm, those individuals did drink more fluid, they did have more urine output, and they had that sustained throughout the entire 24-month follow-up period, although perhaps not surprisingly, at the very beginning, the first 6 months, that's where they did the best. And then those differences between the control group and the intervention arm decreased over time, although, again, the arm that was getting the behavioral intervention was able to have more urine output through the trial. So it was great that what we consider the clinical surrogate endpoint was met in some ways, but we really had set up our trial to look at what we thought was a more patient relevant and health system relevant outcome, which was a symptomatic kidney stone. So that was disappointing and maybe a little bit of a conundrum where things were better in terms of urine output, just like we would expect in the clinic. But the reality is it didn't stop people from forming stones, and there may be a number of reasons for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say one of the more interesting lectures that I give to our doctoral students here at Duke is about surrogate endpoints and how, unfortunately, time and time again, we'll see this pattern where, for sure, if thing A improves, then thing B is definitely going to improve and doesn't always happen in real life. And as you said, there are a number of contributors. So where did you land in your own mind about why the increased water intake, increased urine output, that didn't translate to this hard endpoint?
Yeah. So, my guess is that partly it was the duration of time. This is a 24-month follow-up period, right? Which is, from a statistics perspective, about the right amount of time that stone recurrence would occur at a meaningful rate, and we would be able to detect that in a trial. But, the reality is that the difference between the two groups began to decrease quite substantially by the end of that, although, again, it's still statistically significantly different in terms of urine output. So I think it was partly that. I think also partly the reality is that the control group, because they were given their goal fluid intake, even though they didn't have support for that, was the same. We noticed that there was not that much difference. It wasn't like half a liter difference. It was more like 200 milliliters, 300 milliliters difference between the two arms. And so it may be that because the control group was already getting very intensive prevention care for their kidney stones, even though it was randomized, we may have just been not enough difference to show something clinically. But I think your point about surrogate outcomes here is really important, because the handful of prior studies that had looked at this in stone disease, again, focused only on the behavior change of either drinking more fluid or maybe having more urine output, and also in a short-term time frame. Most behavioral trials run 6 to 12 months. I think we took a swing for the fence, if you will, by going out to 24 months and building in not the surrogate outcome clinically, but the actual outcome of stone recurrence.
So, Chuck, these are super interesting findings. You still see patients and you still give these recommendations. Does that look exactly the same as it did before you were part of this trial, or are you approaching a little bit differently, maybe different emphasis on sort of long-term maintenance?
That's a really great question. I will say it has definitely impacted the way I counsel patients. We still talk about how much fluid to drink because, again, that's our current guideline. It's less clear to me what the guidance should be in terms of how to promote behavioral change. For some people, I still tell them, well, if you're really into data and monitoring, that kind of thing, there's a spottle and you can measure it. Other people have real barriers. There are occupational barriers, for example. So teachers are a great example of this. If you're a classroom teacher, maybe in high school, middle school, elementary school, it's like class after class after class, right? There's very short time for bathroom breaks in between. So most teachers, and having been a high school teacher myself, but earlier in my career, I know this to be true. You just don't take time to drink because that means you have to take time to go to the bathroom eventually. So thinking through how to work around those barriers is really challenging. Some of my patients are drivers, either Uber or maybe they drive a truck and those kind of things. Again, people that really can't stop for a bathroom break.
I'm so interested in this aspect of the work because we have lots of different things that we can focus on as targets for behavior change, right? And so we talked about what the PUSH study did, which is pretty well defined and like totally reasonable, and in some ways had some success improving this more sort of proximate outcome. Are you seeing movement in the field to start incorporating some more kind of like structural or environmental aspects to interventions? I know this is so hard to do. And so I think a lot of us think it's outside of our domain. We can't control that somebody's an Uber driver, for example. So I would imagine there's some tension there, right? That the field has a set of interventions that you could study, say, in the course of 2 years in the clinical trial framework. But then there are these big drivers outside of that that can't really be addressed through really any clinical research study. So is that something people are kind of always dealing with in this space? And how do you think about it as an investigator yourself?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think there are certainly constraints that people have in their lives. Sometimes you just can't work around, right? Like drinking water and having bathroom access. A good friend of mine and colleague in New York talks about this a lot, about caddies there. And there's a certain set of restaurants where they can use the bathroom without having to buy a meal there. And one of the things that he does is he thinks about, well, during the period where they have to fluid restrict because of their job, maybe we can do something different. Maybe we can boost something else that will minimize the risk of stone formation when you're dehydrated. And so, for example, we know that higher levels of citrate in your urine, which are easy to do either through dietary supplements or having lemon juice or other foods that have high citrate in them, that will also prevent stones, right? And so maybe we substitute a different behavior therapy or a different medication to prevent them. There's some dietary supplements out there as well now that, again, have high citrate levels in them. And that can maybe substitute for that. no trial evidence for this other than the fact that we know that citrate, it's something we prescribe for people that have low citrate levels in their urine anyway. So that's one way that people have tried to get around this. But because the number one recommendation, diet and lifestyle wise, is about hydration, that makes it a little challenging to come up with alternative strategies if you don't have bathroom access.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other question that you touched on a bit earlier is even if this were a home run and you saw huge reductions in symptomatic stones, there's a question about what happens when the trial ends and when maybe incentives are no longer there. So I'll just say kudos for working in a really challenging space with respect to long-term sustainment. But have there been any advances in the field that are working on the implementation piece of this for the interventions that are successful in a research setting? And I know you all were very much on the initial sort of outcome phase of things, but if push had been successful, so to speak, for that outcome, how are you guys thinking about sustainment?
Yeah, so I think sustaining the behavior changes is really hard, which is why we all have a long list of New Year's resolutions that we fail to adhere to in the long term. One opportunity is to think about how do we individualize these interventions. So if someone has difficulty drinking water because of some occupational factor, then maybe we come up with something different for them. Or maybe we think about what is the timing of that hydration, and maybe that's important as well. So we can change that timing and still get some benefit. And maybe some of those kind of interventions where you have a trained professional coach that can help work through areas that are specific to an individual's daily life are important. The other thing that has been emerging over the course of the PUSH trial is that there seems to be a pretty clear association between increased heat, like heat waves. We have these really hot summer days or hot days that are not in the summertime, and the number of emergency department visits for kidney stones. And so we believe that heat is a real risk factor. So for some of my folks that are outdoor workers, like farmers or construction workers, we talk about, okay, well, maybe we should think about the risk of the day, right? If it's a nice day out, not too hot, you're not sweating a lot, not having a lot of insensible fluid losses, then maybe we don't worry about it as much. But maybe on those days where you know it's going to be hot and you know you're going to be working outside, that's a day where you really take a more proactive stance about your fluid intake, for example. And so trying to set up circumstances or plan ahead, make plans for people so that they can hear when it's most important, I think would be another strategy that would come out of the recent science around temperature and stones, as well as the PUSH study focusing on that. It'd be great to do a trial to see what happens if we assign people to drink, focusing primarily on those high-risk environmental situations.
You may also get some great ideas from the toddler mom community because we are also very proactive with our planning, shall we say, about bathroom access before we leave the house, making sure that we're set up for success. So you might get some interesting ideas there as well. Chuck, thank you so much for coming and joining us for this conversation today. This has been super interesting. I think about all the areas where you have expertise, and I'll just say, I think you found a multi-layered, complex problem that really warrants your brain and your thinking and your creative approaches to solving this. So I know there's a lot more work to do in this area, and so excited to follow that work and hopefully have you on in the future as you continue down this path really of how behavior can influence health and how we can impact that behavior. So thanks for being here.
We'd love that. Thanks again for having me today.
Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond the Endpoint. As always, I encourage you to share your thoughts by emailing our team at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. And don't forget to subscribe on SoundCloud, Spotify, Amazon Music, or Apple Podcasts. You can also connect with the Duke Clinical Research Institute on LinkedIn or by following at DCRI News on X and Blue Sky.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.